The wind carried the smell of rain and smoke across the prairie that evening. The young farmer stood at the edge of his field, staring toward the horizon where the sun was sinking behind the red cliffs. The land was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against the chest. He'd heard stories about this part of the territory. Stories about raiding parties, burned wagons, and Apaches who vanished into the rocks like shadows. But he didn't believe half of them. This valley had become his home. He'd built it with his own hands, one board and one prayer at a time. He'd come west with nothing but a mule, a rifle, and a dream of owning a piece of land he could call his own. The earth was harsh, the neighbors scarce, and the loneliness deeper than any canyon. But he liked it that way. No one to judge him, no one to interfere. Until that day when the storm brought something, or rather, someone, unexpected to his door. It began with the sound of horses, faint at first, blending with the rolling thunder. He turned expecting a ranch hand or a traveler seeking shelter. But when the riders came into view, his breath caught. 3 Apache women rode bareback, their dark hair whipping in the wind, their faces streaked with dust and rain. They didn't look lost. They looked like they owned the land itself. He didn't move. The fence post he'd been holding fell from his hand, landing softly in the mud. The youngest of the 3 dismounted first, her feet sinking into the wet earth. Her eyes were sharp as a hawk's, studying him as if she were measuring his soul. The middle one said something in Apache, a soft rhythm that the rain almost drowned out. The eldest, tall and proud, finally spoke in halting English. "We mean no harm," she said. "Our camp, gone. We seek shelter, just for night." The farmer hesitated. He knew what the neighboring ranchers would say. No Apache should ever be trusted. But looking at them, he couldn't find anger or deceit in their faces. Only exhaustion and a strange kind of dignity. He nodded once. "You can stay in the barn. It's dry." The women exchanged a glance, then followed him silently through the field. He led them past the corral, where the horses stamped nervously, and opened the barn door. They stepped inside, shaking rain from their hair. For a while no one spoke. The storm's rumble filled the silence between them. Later, as he brought them blankets and a pail of water, he caught their whispers. Soft, curious words in a language he didn't understand. When he set the bucket down, the youngest of the 3 turned to him and said something he never forgot. Her voice was low, almost uncertain, as if she were confessing something forbidden. "We never touched a white man before," she murmured. The words hung in the air, heavy and strange. He didn't know what she meant, fear, wonder, or warning. But her tone made the barn feel smaller, the distance between them shorter. He stepped back, unsure of what to say, and she looked away quickly, as if embarrassed by her own honesty. He left them there, but sleep refused to come that night. The storm passed, yet he could still hear their voices outside, soft like the wind brushing against dry grass. Something about their presence unsettled him. It wasn't danger he felt, but change, the kind that creeps into a man's life without permission. By morning, the sun rose over the wet plains, and the world smelled of damp soil and new beginnings. The 3 sisters were already awake, their fire smoking behind the barn. One was tending a wounded horse, another grinding cornmeal with a smooth stone, and the third was looking toward the river as if searching for something, or someone. He brought them coffee, unsure whether they'd take it. They did, politely but without a smile. The eldest introduced herself first, her English careful, shaped by effort. She told him they had fled from soldiers who attacked their camp near the San Pedro Hills. Their father had been captured. Their mother's fate was unknown. They had been riding for 3 days without food, chased by men wearing blue coats. He listened in silence, the mug warm in his hands. He didn't know what to say. The war between the army and the Apaches wasn't his fight. He was just a farmer. But the image of 3 women alone, hunted across the desert, stirred something in him he couldn't name. As the days passed, they stayed longer than he expected. They helped repair his fence, cooked meals from the meager supplies he had, and tended his animals with surprising skill. The quiet around his farm began to change. It felt alive again. Laughter returned in brief moments, though faint and cautious. Still, the townsfolk started whispering. When he went to the trading post, the shopkeeper asked where he'd been keeping his company. "Word's spreading," the man warned. 3 Apache women living under your roof? That won't sit right with folks around here." The farmer didn't answer. He just paid for his supplies and left. He'd seen enough hypocrisy in town to know he didn't care for their judgment. But the danger wasn't just gossip. The soldiers who patrolled the borderlands didn't take kindly to those who offered help to the tribes. One afternoon, a rider in a blue coat stopped by asking questions. "You seen any Apaches come through this way?" he asked. "3 of them sisters. Dangerous kind." The farmer's pulse quickened. He shook his head. "Haven't seen anyone but coyotes." The soldier studied him for a long time, then spat into the dirt. "You'd best keep it that way. They slit throats in their sleep, those ones." That night the sisters didn't sleep. The eldest sat by the window with a bough across her knees. The youngest whispered something to him when he brought her a lantern. "You lied for us," she said softly. "Why?" He hesitated. "Because you didn't deserve what they'd do to you." Her eyes held his for a long moment, dark and unreadable. "Then you stand between us and your own people. That makes you a marked man." The next morning he found one of his fences torn down. Tracks led into the brush, horse hooves, boot prints. He didn't need to be told what it meant. The soldiers were close. By sundown, the sky burned orange and red. The sisters packed quietly, their movements quick and practiced. The eldest told him they had to leave before the patrols came. He felt something tighten inside him, something like fear but mixed with regret. "You could stay," he said. "There's enough land here for all of us. No one has to know." The eldest shook her head. "They always find out, and when they do, it's you they'll hang first." He wanted to argue, but before he could, the youngest approached him. She placed her hand lightly on his arm, her touch warm and trembling. "If we live," she said, "we will remember the man who did not fear us." Then she whispered again, almost like the first night. "We never touched a white man before." He froze, the weight of those words sinking deeper this time. She looked at him once more, eyes filled with something he didn't understand. Gratitude, sorrow, or maybe both. Then she mounted her horse, joined her sisters, and rode toward the darkening horizon. He stood alone as the wind rose again, carrying the last echo of their voices across the fields. Somewhere beyond the ridges, thunder rolled once more. He knew he hadn't seen the last of them, and deep inside, a part of him hoped he never would, because if he did, it could only mean trouble was coming back to his quiet valley. That night, as the stars came out over the prairie, the young farmer sat on his porch with his rifle beside him. The world felt different now, as if a line had been crossed that could never be drawn back. Somewhere in the desert, 3 Apache sisters were riding toward their fate, and somehow, his own fate was tied to theirs. The days that followed were quiet, but not peaceful. The young farmer went about his chores as usual, feeding the livestock, repairing the corral, tending to the fields. But his mind wandered to the 3 Apache sisters who had disappeared into the desert. Every gust of wind seemed to carry their laughter. Every echo from the canyon reminded him of their voices. He had lived alone for years and thought himself used to silence, but now that silence felt heavier. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was absence. He often found himself looking toward the trail where they had ridden off, wondering if they were alive, or if the soldiers had caught them. The world beyond his fence line felt like a different country, full of unseen dangers. Even the animals seemed restless. His horse snorted at shadows, and the dog barked into the wind as if warning something unseen. He knew what fear smelled like. It was in the soil, in the smoke, in the quiet before dusk. The next trip into town only deepened his unease. He rode in to trade corn and pick up supplies, but conversation stopped when he entered the general store. Men turned from the counter, their eyes following him. The shopkeeper tried to keep his tone friendly, but the strain in his voice was clear. "Heard the soldiers found a burned camp near the ridge," the man said, tying a bundle of rope. Said it was Apaches. 3 women among them, though no bodies found. "They think the rest scattered south." The farmer kept his expression still. "Maybe they moved on," he said quietly. The shopkeeper shrugged. "Maybe, but folks around here are on edge. Some say the army'll sweep through again. They don't like anyone keeping company with Indians. You understand." He nodded, paid for his things, and left. But as he mounted his horse, he caught sight of 2 men near the saloon watching him. One whispered something to the other and spat into the dirt. The farmer didn't need to guess what they were thinking. The frontier was a place where suspicion grew faster than crops. That night, back at his cabin, he couldn't shake the sense that he was being watched. The moon rose bright over the valley, painting the grass in silver. He checked his traps, his fences, the barn. Everything was as it should be. Yet, when he turned to head back, he saw a flicker of movement near the edge of the trees. He raised his lantern and caught sight of a shadow slipping away into the dark. His first thought was soldiers, but the shape was too quick, too quiet. Then from behind a rock a faint whistle sounded. He froze. That sound, He remembered it from the night the sisters arrived. A soft rising tone like a bird call. "Who's there?" he called out. The only answer was the cry of an owl. He lowered the lantern slowly, heart pounding. He wanted to believe it was nothing, just the tricks of the night. But when he woke at dawn, he found footprints near the barn. Bare footprints, light and narrow. For 2 days he saw no one, but the feeling stayed. Then on the third evening, as he was hauling water from the well, a voice came from behind him. "You shouldn't have lied for us." He spun around. The youngest Apache sister stood there, half hidden by the fading light. Her hair was tangled, her face streaked with dust. Behind her, the middle sister appeared, leading a limping horse. The eldest came last, silent as ever, her bow slung over her shoulder. He stared, half in disbelief. "You're alive." "For now," the eldest said. "The soldiers burned our trail. We went north, but they followed. We need water and rest." He didn't hesitate. "You can stay, for as long as you need." They entered the barn again, and for the first time in weeks his land felt alive. Yet beneath the relief was something darker. If the soldiers were still tracking them, it was only a matter of time before trouble reached his doorstep. Over the next days, he learned more about them. Their father had been a respected Apache scout who once guided soldiers through the mountains before turning against them when they broke a treaty. Their people had been forced into camps, their land taken, their families scattered. The sisters had refused to surrender, escaping with a handful of others who now were either dead or captured. The eldest, strong and quiet, carried the weight of their survival. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her words carried authority. The middle one was cautious, often tending to their horse or sharpening her knife by the fire. The youngest was different. She asked questions about everything, about farming tools, about why he lived alone, about why he helped strangers at all. One morning she watched him mend a broken plow. "Why do you stay here?" she asked. "You could live near your people. You could have a wife, a family." He smiled faintly. "Had one once. Fever took her. I stayed because the land doesn't lie. It gives back what you work for." She nodded, thoughtful. "Our people say the land belongs to no one. It only lends itself to those who listen." He looked up and their eyes met. There was no mistrust anymore, only curiosity. She had the kind of spirit that made him feel both uneasy and alive. But the world they lived in didn't allow such things to grow. One afternoon, smoke appeared in the distance. The sisters saw it first, thin and gray against the horizon. The eldest's jaw tightened. "They are close. Could be settlers," he said. "No, soldiers burn brush when they track. To smoke us out." By nightfall, they had packed what little they had. The farmer wanted to help them flee, but they refused. "You've done enough," the eldest said. "They'll come for us, not for you." But he couldn't accept that. He'd seen the look in the soldiers' eyes, the kind that didn't care who they hurt to make a point. He knew if they found traces of Apache near his farm, they'd burn it all to the ground. When darkness fell, he saddled his horse and rode toward the ridge, hoping to see how close the patrol was. The air smelled of smoke and dust. The moon cast long shadows across the plain. As he reached the high ground, he saw them. 5 soldiers gathered by a fire, their horses tethered nearby. One of them held a torn piece of fabric. "Found this near a creek," one said. "Woman's cloth." "They can't be far." The farmer watched quietly from the rocks. His hands clenched the reins. He knew he couldn't fight them, not alone. But if he didn't do something, they'd find the sisters by morning. He returned to the farm in silence. The sisters were waiting by the barn, their faces pale in the moonlight. "They're close," he said. "Half a day's ride," the eldest nodded. "Then we leave before sunrise." The youngest stepped forward. "You shouldn't come. They'll hang you for helping us." He shook his head. "I can't just stand by." Something flickered in her expression. Fear, maybe gratitude. "You're not like them," she said softly. "Most white men see us as ghosts or enemies. You see us as people. But if they catch you with us, you'll vanish like the rest." Her words stayed with him long after they left. By dawn, they were riding south through the hills, following a dry riverbed toward the mountains. He guided them through hidden paths only trappers used. Every so often, the eldest looked back, scanning for riders. The land was vast, but it offered few places to hide. At midday, they stopped by an abandoned cabin near a stream. The farmer gathered wood while the sisters rested. The youngest knelt beside the water, washing her hands. Her reflection trembled on the surface, fragile and bright. "Do you ever wonder," she said quietly, "if people like us were meant to meet, or if it's just the land that forces paths to cross?" He thought for a long moment. Maybe both. Maybe the land brings people together to test what kind of hearts they have. She looked up, and for the first time she smiled. It wasn't wide or lasting, but it softened the weight between them. The moment ended when the eldest returned from the ridge, her face grim. "Tracks," she said. "They followed us." He stood, his pulse quickening. "How close?" "Too close." They doused the fire and prepared to move, but it was already too late. A gunshot echoed through the canyon, and a bullet tore through a tree near them. The horses reared. The sound of shouting carried across the rocks. Soldiers were coming fast. The farmer grabbed his rifle. "Go," he shouted. "Head for the rocks. I'll hold them off." But the youngest refused to leave. "You'll die. Someone has to slow them down." The eldest pulled her away, shouting in Apache. The farmer ran toward the slope, heart pounding as the thunder of hooves drew nearer. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. He aimed once, fired, and saw one rider fall. Then another. But there were too many. He turned to flee, but the ground beneath him gave way, sending him tumbling down the hill. His rifle flew from his hands. The last thing he saw before darkness swept over him was the youngest sister turning her horse back toward him, her hair flying wild in the wind, her voice calling his name across the canyon. When he opened his eyes again, the world was spinning. The fire had gone out, and the night was deep. Somewhere far away, coyotes howled. His head throbbed and his vision blurred. But through the pain, he could still hear something, soft footsteps approaching, and a familiar voice whispering words he could barely understand. "We never touched a white man before," she murmured again, her voice trembling now. "But tonight we'll see if one can survive among us." And before he could speak, everything went dark again. The first thing he noticed when he woke was the smell of sage and smoke. He was lying in a shallow cave, his head wrapped in a strip of cloth that smelled faintly of pine pitch. Water cooled his lips. The youngest sister sat beside him with a small gourd in her hands. In the half-light, he could see the others near the mouth of the cave, silhouettes against the sky. The middle one watched the slope below, listening for riders. The eldest crouched by a small fire no bigger than a hat, feeding it twigs and whispering a prayer in her tongue. He tried to sit up, but the world tilted. The youngest steadied him with a firm hand, then drew her fingers back as if she had touched a coal. She kept her eyes on the ground, as if the space between them had rules she feared to break. He could still hear the echo of her words from the night before, the way fear and resolve had knotted together in her voice. He thanked her for pulling him from the rocks. She only nodded. No one spoke of the soldiers. They waited out the day in the shadow of the stone. Hawks circled far above, riding the warm current. Twice the eldest signaled for silence, head tilted, listening. Hoofbeats passed below on the old trail, then faded. Toward evening, the youngest helped him to his feet, and they moved along a ledge hidden by pinyon boughs. The path carried them to a dry wash cut through the hills where animal tracks crossed in all directions. Their horses had been stashed beneath a rock outcrop. He recognized his own by the scar on its shoulder. The animal pushed its nose into his chest and blew a tired breath, as if scolding him for the tumble. They rode after dusk, following the white line of the wash until it emptied into a stand of cottonwoods. The sisters guided them to a low place where the roots drank from a buried stream. There, beneath a fallen trunk, the eldest uncovered a cache of food wrapped in a deerskin. Dried meat, ground corn, a pouch of salt. It was proof of how long their people had lived with the chase. He felt clumsy beside such preparation, a man who had trusted fences more than the land. When they ate, he told them what he had heard in town. A new officer had taken command at the fort after the last raid. Younger, colder, he had orders to gather all those who had escaped the agency and take them back by any means. The trader had whispered another rumor, too. A hired scout rode with the soldiers. A man who knew both the language and the land. A man who once rode with his wife's brother during the spring hunts. The farmer had only crossed paths with him twice, but the memory of the scout's pale eyes stirred like ash in his chest. If the scout was leading that patrol, the sisters were in worse danger than they knew. The eldest listened without blinking. At last, she said the scout's name under her breath like a stone set down. The sisters exchanged a glance that spoke of old betrayal. The middle one said the scout had eaten their food once and accepted tobacco from their father. Then he had sold a winter trail to soldiers for a bottle. That trade had taken 2 children and a grandmother. If this was the same man, mercy would not come cheap. They decided to move west along the basalt ridges, where the ground chewed up tracks. The farmer argued that they should split, since 4 riders together were easy to follow. The eldest agreed, but not as he expected. She sent the middle sister toward a canyon known for hidden springs, traveling light as a runner, with orders to meet them at the dark gate where the lava fields began. The youngest would stay near the farmer and circle high ground with him, setting false marks and turning stones. The eldest promised to cross the soldier's path and break it with tricks her father had taught her, then find them again near the night hills. They parted under a sky crowded with stars. The farmer and the youngest climbed to a shoulder of rock where the wind shaved the heat from their faces. From there, the plain opened like a map. He showed her how farmers read distance by the shape of cottonwoods, and how homesteads arranged their fences to resist flood. She showed him how to lay down a scent with crushed creosote, and how to step on the edge of a boot print to thin it. They spoke in low voices and sometimes with hands when a word would have carried. A strange partnership grew there, stitched of need and a careful respect neither dared name. At dawn they found sign of a small herd moving slow. The farmer frowned, counting prints. Those animals were not wild. Cattle had drifted into the badlands where no rancher should have sent them. The youngest studied the churned earth and pointed to cut marks on a stone. Fresh. That meant trouble of a different kind. Rustlers used the ridges as much as soldiers, and rustlers killed without a flag. They followed at a distance until they saw smoke rising from a shallow basin. Through the brush they watched two men butcher a steer, their horses tied to a greasewood bush. Both wore dust coats, both carried old rifles. One had a bandage wrapped around his arm. The farmer recognized him from the trading post, a talkative drifter who bragged after 3 drinks. The other he did not know. The youngest touched his sleeve and shook her head. No fight, no noise. He agreed, but a thought took hold. If rustlers were working this ground, they would draw attention. Soldiers might think the sisters had raided cattle, and then the rope would come even if no theft was theirs. It was a knot of blame that had caught other people before. They pulled back and skirted the basin. By noon the heat pressed them thin. In the distance a thin line of dust marched like a second horizon. Riders steady and patient. The youngest squinted, and then turned her palm down sharply. Time to run. They cut south into broken country where the ground lifted in dark teeth. Twice the farmer's horse stumbled. Twice the youngest steadied the bridle and breathed into the animal's ear until its panic sank. In the shelter of a black ledge they waited and drank the last of their water. The youngest removed his bandage and checked the wound on his head, then bound it tight again. He tried to joke that the land had hard hands, but the smile fell from his face when she answered with none. "You are not made for this chase," she said quietly. "You are made for straight rows and summer rain." He told her that might be true, but a man still had to look his choices in the eye. Near dusk, a shadow crossed the sun. The eldest slipped in from the rocks like a piece of the landscape that had changed its mind and moved. She had found sign of the middle sister near the dark gate and left a mark there, then circled back to check on them. The patrol had divided. 2 riders and the scout were angling toward the springs. The rest were fanning north. The plan was working, but it also meant that if the scout reached the canyon first, the middle sister would be trapped. The farmer expected the eldest to turn back and warn her. Instead, she looked to him and to the youngest, and asked a question in English that carried the weight of trust. "Can you lead the soldiers away while we call our sister?" He swallowed. Riding into the open with men who wanted to make an example of someone was not a small thing, but the alternative was leaving a woman to face the scout alone. He nodded and asked for a single favor in return. If he were taken, would they see his farm did not burn? The eldest's eyes softened like coals losing wind. She touched 2 fingers to her chest and bowed her head once. Then she was gone, a swift shadow across stone. They rode low along the ridge, the farmer and the youngest, and then dropped into a wash that spilled onto open ground. He pushed his horse into a trot that left a clean, readable trail. Twice he stood in the stirrups to lift his hat to the wind, letting the brim flash like a signal. The trick worked. The dust line hesitated, tightened, and then flowed toward them. As the chase took shape, the youngest looked back and said that if they made the tall mesa by night, they could lose their pursuers in a cleft her people used when they hunted antelope. He told her to take the lead and tried to ignore the needle of fear that threaded his throat. While they ran, the story widened elsewhere. Back near the fort, the officer with cold eyes met with the trader over a ledger. The trader traced numbers while the officer traced land. Between them lay a plan that had little to do with safety and much to do with fences. If the patrol flushed the sisters and anyone seen with them, the valley would learn a neat lesson about who ruled the range. The trader would buy foreclosed plots at winter prices and sell them back come spring. The officer would write a report about order and progress. The hired scout would drink from a tin cup and pretend not to hear. A small empire could be hammered together out of fear if you had enough nails. In town, other forces moved. A schoolteacher with sharp eyes and a plain dress heard talk at the counter and frowned into her coffee. She had once taught arithmetic to a little girl with a braid like rope and a laugh that shook dust from her boots. That girl had vanished when soldiers came. The teacher had kept the slate the child left behind. Now she saw maps rolled on the trader's shelf and men with badges writing in pairs. She wrote a letter she did not send and put her only silver spoon in her pocket. She knew which widow lived near the valley and which door would open to a quiet knock. Not all help rides a horse, she told herself. Some walks on tired feet. At the mesa, the chase climbed from heat into wind. The youngest led them along a side slope that mocked hooves with loose rock. Twice the farmer thought they would be thrown, yet she found purchase where he saw none. Shots cracked from the flats below, far off and high. The soldiers were trying to scare them into a mistake. The sound had the opposite effect. It focused the air and made the path feel like a wire stretched across a canyon. The youngest stopped once and looked at his bandage. He told her he could manage. She said nothing, but he saw her jaw set, as if she carried not only her own fear but his. They reached the cleft as night rose from the ground. It was a seam in the rock so narrow that a rider had to slide from the saddle and lead the horse sideways. Inside, the air cooled like a cellar. They moved 100 paces and then 100 more, feeling their way with palms and the scrape of leather. Above them, the sound of hoofbeats echoed and then thinned. When they came out on the far side, the stars were close enough to touch. The youngest lifted her face to the sky and whispered thanks. He listened and whispered his own in the words he had learned as a boy, not sure who was hearing, only sure that someone should. They slept in turns beside a juniper. Toward morning, a coyote sang, and not long after, the eldest returned with the middle sister behind her. The reunion was spare, strong, the kind that needs no display. The middle one had a new cut on her arm and a fire in her eyes. She told them the scout had reached the canyon, but had followed the wrong branch after finding the decoy marks the eldest had left. The sisters had crossed above him on a ledge only sheep would trust. He had looked up once and smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes, as if he respected the trick and would not forget it. They gathered around a cold hearth of stones and laid out a thin plan. The sisters would travel farther west to join kin rumored to be camped near a salt lake. The route would take them behind the fort and through the scrub where no patrol liked to ride. The farmer could turn north and cut across to his valley, returning as a man who had hunted strays for 2 hard days and found none. If questioned, he would say he had followed rustlers and gotten lost. It was thin as a thread across a river, but it was a thread. He almost agreed. Then the youngest looked at him and asked a question that did not fit the plan. If you go home now, will you sleep? He opened his mouth and closed it again. She had seen the porch where he sat with his rifle and the empty table waiting for a second plate. She had seen the way he looked at the line of hills where they had first appeared. He wanted to tell her that sleep came easy to a tired man, but the lie would not move past his teeth. From the plain below came the far clang of iron on iron, a sound like a blacksmith's hammer. The eldest stiffened. The fort was setting out another column. The trader's plan or the officer's pride, it did not matter. The hunt was now bigger than the 4 of them. Even if they made the salt lake, the net would spread. He said so aloud, and the sisters fell silent. The youngest broke the stillness with an idea that tasted of risk. There was a canyon near the farmer's valley, where their father had once hidden a stolen herd to force a treaty talk. If cattle appeared there again, and if word spread that rustlers had taken them, the soldiers would turn their eyes while the sisters slipped past the back of the hunt. It was a gamble that required nerve and a man willing to walk into town and speak carefully to the wrong ears. He felt the shape of the plan settle in his bones. It would mean riding home with the youngest at his side to lay sign where sign would make a noise, then riding out again with empty saddlebags and a face full of dust to tell a story built on parts of the truth. It would mean moving cattle quietly in the dark and leaving tracks where rustlers would be blamed. It would mean trusting that the schoolteacher would carry a word to the widow, and the widow to a cousin with a pasture on the edge, and that all those threads would hold. The eldest studied him a long time. You could keep your hands clean, she said. No one would blame you for that. He met her gaze. Hands that plant seed are never clean. She considered this, then touched the small pouch at her throat and nodded once. The middle sister tightened her bandage and rolled her shoulders as if preparing for a long road. The youngest looked toward the east where the sky was paling and then looked back at him. Her voice was steady, though he heard a tremor that matched his own. We never touched a white man before, she said, but you walk with us like a brother walks. If we fall, you will be named. If we live, you will be marked. Choose with open eyes. He stood and tested his weight. The pain in his head had settled into a steady drum, but his feet held. He checked his saddle cinch and the powder horn he had carried more out of habit than intent. He thought of his field and the corn rising, and the way the porch boards creaked in the cool of evening. He thought of the scout's pale eyes and the trader's ledger, and the officer's clean gloves. Then he looked at the three figures before him, each carrying a different piece of the same fire. He swung into the saddle and said he would ride for the canyon by nightfall. The eldest nodded and said they would leave sign where only he would think to look. The middle sister grinned a quick grin that made her look younger. Then it vanished under the hard work of the day. The youngest stepped near as if to adjust his reins, then let her hand fall before it reached the leather. Her eyes held his for a moment that felt longer than it was. The wind freshened on the mesa. Far off, a trumpet sounded from the fort, thin and bright. Somewhere nearer, a steer lowed in confusion. The land waited, and the thin plan stretched like a wire across open space. He turned his horse toward the line of low hills that guarded his valley. Behind him, the sisters melted into the broken country, heading for shadow and chance. Ahead, the path narrowed to a decision that would carry his name whether he spoke it aloud or not. By the time he reached the canyon, the sun had dropped low enough to turn the cliffs red as fire. The farmer rode slow, every sense sharpened. The land was too still. Even the birds had gone quiet. He could hear the rhythm of his horse's hooves echoing against the stone walls, steady as a heartbeat. He knew the plan depended on precision. One wrong sound, one careless move, and everything would crumble. He guided the horse down toward the narrow basin where the herd grazed. The cattle were restless, snorting and shifting in the dry grass. Their hides glowed copper in the fading light. He counted them quickly, enough to make the soldiers believe a band of thieves had gathered here. He'd already loosened part of the fence line earlier, leaving just enough broken posts to look like a forced entry. It had to seem messy but not false. The world could tell the difference between a true struggle and a staged one. The youngest sister appeared from the far side of the canyon, her dark hair loose, her horse coated in dust. She rode silently until she was close enough for him to hear her whisper. The others are near the ridge. They'll wait for the signal fire before crossing. He nodded. Once this herd runs, the soldiers will follow the noise. They'll think they've found the thieves. She looked toward the valley, her eyes scanning the distant plains. And if they see us instead? He tightened his grip on the reins. Then we ride hard and pray the dust blinds them. She dismounted and walked beside him, her hand brushing the tall grass. Our people say the land remembers footsteps. Even lies leave marks. He turned to her, his voice rough. Then I hope this lie saves you. They worked in silence as the sky darkened. The farmer tied a lantern near the broken fence and poured a line of oil through the brush to where the grass grew thick. It wasn't meant to burn far, only to flash enough light to draw attention. When the first stars came out, he struck the match. The flame caught, ran quick, and threw a golden light over the herd. The animals spooked instantly, bawling and scattering. Hooves thundered as they broke through the fence and poured into the open desert, leaving a storm of dust behind. From the distance came a sound that froze the blood in his veins, the sharp echo of a bugle. The soldiers were closer than he thought. He turned to the youngest. Ride now! They mounted fast, galloping through the narrow pass that led toward the dry riverbed. Behind them, the flames flared and smoke curled up toward the stars. He could already hear the distant shouts of men, the clang of metal against rock. The trap had worked, but maybe too well. They reached the ridge where the eldest and middle sisters waited with fresh horses and supplies. The eldest's face was grave. You lit the fire too soon. They'll reach the canyon before dawn. That's the point, he said. They'll find the herd and chase shadows. It gives you time to cross the flats, she shook her head. They'll find your tracks too. You can't go back now. I wasn't planning to. The youngest looked at him sharply. You said you'd return to the valley. I will when it's safe. But if they trace us through this canyon, I'll lead them off your trail first. The eldest studied him for a long moment, then said quietly, A man who runs toward danger instead of away invites spirits that never leave him. He smiled faintly. Maybe they'll keep me company. She didn't smile back. She only turned to her sisters and gave a signal. They rode west, leaving him behind in the shadow of the rocks. He watched them disappear, feeling the weight of the land settle around him. The silence was almost holy. He spent the night near the edge of the canyon, waiting. The moon rose bright, turning every shadow sharp. Around midnight he saw them, dark figures moving along the ridge, torches flickering. The soldiers had found the fire. He counted at least 10, their shapes shifting against the rocks. And leading them was a man on a white horse. Even from a distance he recognized the posture, the cold precision of someone who thought himself untouchable. The scout. The man dismounted, knelt near the trampled grass, and touched the ground like a hunter reading the wind. Then he looked up, scanning the canyon with pale, calculating eyes. The farmer's stomach turned cold. The scout wasn't fooled. He moved back into the darkness, careful not to make a sound. The plan had bought time, but not much. By dawn, the patrol would be riding hard again. He knew what he had to do. He would ride south, leave a false trail into the Badlands, and keep the soldiers chasing ghosts until the sisters reached the Salt Lake. He saddled up, every motion slow and quiet. Before leaving, he glanced toward the horizon where faint stars still glimmered over the far ridges. Somewhere out there, the sisters were riding through that same darkness. He whispered a prayer that the land would hide them. As the first light broke, he guided his horse across the flats, leaving deliberate tracks through the soft sand. He rode until the sun was high, then turned sharply toward a narrow ravine where the cliffs folded in on themselves. It was a dead end to anyone who didn't know the land, but he'd hunted here before. There was a narrow crack near the back, wide enough for a man and a horse if he turned sideways. He ducked into it just as dust clouds rose behind him. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder. Voices echoed down the canyon walls. He could make out the scout's voice barking orders. "Tracks go this way! He's close!" The farmer's heart hammered. He held his breath as the soldiers thundered past the entrance, their torches flashing in brief orange bursts. For a moment he thought they were gone, but then he heard a voice closer, slower. The scout had dismounted. "You can hide from the soldiers," the scout said, his voice calm, almost amused. "But not from me." The farmer's grip tightened on his rifle. Through the slit of the rocks, he saw the white horse's shadow drift across the sand. The scout's boots crunched softly as he walked closer. "You helped them, didn't you?" the man said, his tone easy, conversational. "3 Apache women. That's what all this is about." He paused, then laughed under his breath. "You think they'll remember your kindness when they're free? They'll vanish into the desert and leave you for dead. That's how it always ends." The farmer stayed silent. Sweat slid down his neck. The scout turned his face toward the rocks, his pale eyes catching the light. "You were smarter when you stayed behind your fences. Should have known not to mix with ghosts." For a long moment, neither moved. Then a gust of wind rushed through the canyon, lifting a swirl of dust. The scout's shadow shifted away. Hooves struck stone, fading into distance. The farmer exhaled slowly, his pulse pounding like a drum. He waited another hour before emerging. The sun was dropping again, the horizon glowing gold. He followed a dry streambed south until the land opened into low plains. He didn't know if the soldiers were still behind him, but instinct told him the chase wasn't over. By dusk, he reached a rise overlooking his valley. The fields were still, his cabin standing alone against the wind. Smoke curled from the chimney, a faint gray thread against the sky. He frowned. He hadn't left a fire burning. He approached cautiously, rifle ready. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and dust. From the side window he saw movement inside, 2 figures seated at his table. One was the shopkeeper from town. The other, wearing the same white hat he'd seen in the canyon, was the scout. The farmer's pulse quickened. The soldiers hadn't followed him. They'd gone ahead. The trap wasn't his anymore. It was theirs. He backed away from the window and slipped around to the barn. Inside, his horse shifted nervously. Hanging from a beam was a lantern, the same one the youngest sister had used when they lit the fire. A thin strip of cloth was tied to its handle, Apache cloth, a message. He untied it and read the faint charcoal marks scrawled across the fabric. "They know. Run." He barely had time to think before the door creaked behind him. The scout's voice came, calm and low. "You're a hard man to track." The farmer turned, rifle raised. The scout stood just inside the doorway, hands empty but eyes sharp. "I could kill you now," the scout said, "but I'd rather know why. Why risk everything for them?" "They needed help." "That all?" The scout stepped closer. "You think you're saving them? You're saving no one. The land doesn't change for kindness." The farmer's jaw tightened. "Maybe not, but it remembers." For a moment, silence hung between them like a drawn blade. Then the scout smiled thinly. "You sound like them." He moved fast, faster than the farmer expected. The rifle went off, the shot cracking through the barn like thunder. The scout lunged, grabbing for the barrel. They struggled, boots sliding in the straw. The lantern tipped, oil spilling, fire licking at the floorboards. The farmer wrenched free, the heat searing his arm. The flames spread quick, feeding on dry hay. Smoke filled the air. The scout drew a knife, the blade flashing orange in the firelight. "You think you can burn me out?" the scout growled. The farmer swung the rifle stock hard, striking the man across the jaw. The knife clattered away. For a heartbeat, he thought he had him, but the scout recovered, driving a knee into his ribs. Both men fell against the burning wall. Outside, the horses screamed. Inside, the fire roared. The farmer kicked the scout back and staggered toward the open door, coughing through smoke. The night air hit his lungs like a wave. He turned once, expecting to see the man down, but the scout was already up, silhouetted by the fire, his face a mask of fury. "You can't hide them forever," the scout shouted. "The land will bury you with them." The farmer mounted his horse and rode into the night, the barn collapsing behind him in a storm of sparks. The wind carried the smell of burning wood across the valley. He didn't look back. The chase had changed again. Now it wasn't about escape. It was about survival. Somewhere beyond the dark ridges, the sisters were waiting, unaware that the enemy had already crossed the river. The farmer pushed the horse harder, the cold air slicing his face. By dawn, he could see the faint glow of a campfire flickering in the distance. He slowed, heart pounding. If that was the sisters, they were too exposed. If it wasn't, he was riding straight into danger. He dismounted, crept forward through the brush, and saw the truth. 3 shapes around the fire, but not the sisters. Soldiers. And one man in a white hat, face bruised, eyes burning with vengeance. The farmer ducked behind a rock, his breath ragged. The fire cracked, casting shadows across the sand. The scout's voice carried on the wind, low and certain. "He'll come for them," the man said. "He'll lead us straight to the Apache women." The farmer's hands clenched around his rifle. The next move he made would decide everything: the sisters' lives, his land, his soul. And for the first time, he realized the line between hunted and hunter was gone. They were all trapped in the same fire now, and only one side would walk out alive. The farmer stayed hidden behind the rocks, his breath shallow, watching the soldiers by the fire. The scout sat with his face turned toward the flames, a dark bruise along his jaw where the rifle had struck him. His pale eyes burned with something more dangerous than anger, a quiet certainty that he'd already won. Around him, the soldiers cleaned their rifles and muttered about the chase. They had been riding for 2 days without rest, and the sound of boots scraping against stone echoed like the pulse of the land itself. The farmer knew he couldn't wait until morning. The sisters were moving through the lower pass, unaware that the soldiers were lying in wait near the canyon's mouth. If he stayed hidden, they'd be caught before dawn. If he attacked now, he'd stand little chance against 6 armed men. But there was no time left for safety. The wind was rising, carrying with it the scent of rain and distant thunder. The desert was about to change its shape, and he meant to use it. He crawled through the brush until he reached the far side of the camp, where the horses were tied. They pawed nervously at the ground, picking up his scent. He whispered softly, calming them, then cut the reins of 2. The animals bolted, hooves drumming the hard earth. Shouts erupted from the camp as the soldiers scrambled after them. In that chaos, the farmer raised his rifle and fired once. The shot struck the ground near the fire, spraying dirt into the scout's face. The men ducked, returning fire toward the rocks. Sparks flew as bullets hit stone. The scout's voice cut through the noise. "He's alone! Find him!" The farmer ran low, his boots sliding over loose gravel. Another shot whined past his ear. He ducked behind a boulder, reloaded, and fired again, this time aiming for the oil barrel near the fire. The bullet hit. Flames burst upward as the barrel exploded, throwing soldiers backward and filling the night with the roar of burning oil. The camp dissolved into chaos. Through the flames, he saw the scout rise, shouting orders, his white hat glowing orange against the firelight. The farmer turned and ran toward the canyon slope, knowing they would follow. His only hope was to lead them into the dry wash where the ground broke into cracks and hidden pits. He'd ridden that land for years. They hadn't. The storm came fast, as if the sky had been waiting for this moment. Lightning split the clouds. thunder rolling down the canyon walls. The first drops of rain struck his face, mixing with dust and sweat. Behind him, the soldiers' shouts grew faint, scattered by the storm. He reached the ridge where he'd told the sisters to hide and saw the faint glow of a covered lantern. The youngest appeared first, her eyes wide. "We heard the shots. They're close," he said, gasping. "The scouts leading them. You need to move, now." The eldest emerged from the shadows, steady as ever. "We can't keep running. The land's closing in. The storm will wash our tracks, but it will drown the horses too. Then we'll climb," he said. "Up through the pass." The middle sister shook her head. "It's steep. No trail. There's a way," he said. "My wife used to climb it. It'll hold if we move before the floodwater rises." Lightning flashed again, and for a second the ridge above them glowed like a blade. They mounted and rode toward it, rain pelting their faces. The ground beneath them began to tremble with distant water, the roar of a coming flash flood. Behind them, the scout's whistle pierced the wind. He was still on their trail. They reached the narrow pass just as the rain became a curtain. The horses struggled for footing. Rocks tumbled from above, and the smell of wet clay filled the air. The farmer led the way, gripping his horse's mane, guiding it up the slick slope. The sisters followed close behind. The youngest looked back once and saw torches moving below, flickering like angry stars. "They're still coming," she shouted. "Keep going," he called. "The ridge flattens out ahead." But the storm was faster. The sound of water rushing through the canyon rose into a deafening roar. The dry wash below became a river, swallowing the torches one by one. When they reached the top, the wind struck them so hard it nearly tore them from their saddles. The farmer turned, scanning the darkness. Through the rain, he saw the scout on his white horse at the base of the slope, shouting orders to his men. Then a wall of muddy water slammed into the canyon floor, sweeping away everything in its path. The farmer watched, breathing hard. "It's over," he said. But the eldest shook her head. "No, he won't die in water. Men like that float to the next battle." She was right. When the storm passed and dawn broke, the land was quiet again, but the farmer could see a single figure below, crawling out from the mud, dragging himself to solid ground. The scout lived. They didn't wait to see where he went. They rode west for 3 days without stopping. The valley gave way to salt plains, the sun bleaching the world pale. Food was scarce, and the sisters' horses limped from exhaustion. When they finally reached the lake, its surface shimmered white like frost in summer. A small camp waited near the edge, smoke rising from a single fire. Figures moved among the tents, their faces wary but kind. The sisters dismounted slowly. One of the elders came forward, speaking in their language. The eldest answered, and the others listened, their eyes softening. The 3 women had made it home, to their people, to the safety of belonging. The farmer sat apart, watching. He felt like a ghost at the edge of another world. When the youngest came to him, her hands were trembling. "You can stay here," she said. "They'll let you rest," he shook his head. "The soldiers will search again. If they find me with your people, they'll burn this place too." Her voice wavered. "Then where will you go?" "Back home," he said quietly. "I've got land that needs tending. Someone has to keep it alive." She looked down, then stepped closer. "You could stay until the next moon. The land is wide. No one will know." He smiled faintly. "If I stay, I'll bring trouble with me. Better they chase one man than a whole camp." She didn't argue. She only reached for his hand and pressed something into it, a small silver bead tied to a piece of hide. "This was my mother's. When the wind carries it, it means we remember." He closed his fingers around it, unable to speak. The eldest came and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've walked far enough with us. The land will remember what you did." He nodded once. "And I'll remember what it gave me." They parted at dawn. The farmer rode east alone, the desert stretching before him like a sea of gold and dust. He carried no weapons now, only the small token she'd given him. When he reached the ridge above his valley, the air was still. His farm was scarred but standing. The barn was gone, burned to black posts, but the cabin still held its shape. The fields were dry, yet the soil smelled alive. He rebuilt slowly, plank by plank as the seasons turned. Sometimes at dusk he'd hear a cry from far across the hills, a hawk or maybe something else. And on the rare nights when the wind shifted just right, he could almost hear their voices, carried faint and soft. The soldiers never returned to his valley. The trader vanished from town, his store boarded shut. The officer at the fort was reassigned after the flood destroyed half his patrol. Only the scout remained, a rumor that drifted between campfires, a ghost said to ride the riverbeds in search of what the desert had taken. Years later, travelers passing through the farmer's land would stop for water and ask if he'd ever seen Apaches nearby. He would smile and shake his head, saying only that the wind out there had many stories, and some were better left untold. On one quiet morning as he worked the field, he found something half buried in the dirt, a string of beads, the same silver and hide he'd carried once. The wind stirred the cornstalks, whispering like distant laughter. He stood still, the token warm in his hand, and felt that strange calm again, the one that had first come to him the night the sisters appeared. He knew then that they were alive somewhere beyond the ridges, that the land had kept its promise, and maybe, just maybe, the world had shifted a little, enough for men and women once divided by war and fear to share the same wind. As the sun climbed higher, he placed the bead around the neck of his horse and whispered a prayer to the earth, the same way he'd heard the eldest do. Then he went back to his work, the plow cutting a straight, steady line through the soil. The land was quiet but not empty. It carried stories now, of courage, of loss, of kindness that had dared to cross old boundaries. When the breeze rose again, carrying the scent of sage and rain, the farmer lifted his head and smiled. Somewhere out there, 3 Apache sisters rode beneath that same sky, free as the wind. And though their paths had split, their footprints would always share the same earth. The valley slept in peace that evening, the last light of sunset glimmering across the fields, as if the land itself was grateful for those who had fought to keep its heart alive.